by the soft flicker of gaslight. In a cramped Philadelphia boarding house, a woman named Josie tugged gently at her cheeks. The mirror was cracked, the silver behind the glass flaking like old snow. But it would do. She leaned in, inspecting the puffiness under her eyes. Not from crying. Josie didn't cry. Not anymore, but from the relentless lack of sleep that came with life in 1885. Between the coal smoke, the noise, and the hunger, no one in her building was sleeping well. But that morning, she had something important to do. She had an interview at a glove shop downtown, a chance, however small, to be seen as a respectable girl, which meant she had to look, well. So, she reached for the sliver of calf's liver wrapped in muslin. It was cold. The boarding house icebox barely worked, but the meat was still good, dark red, soft, and cool to the touch. She dabbed it across her cheeks, pressing it gently into her skin. Not smearing, not rubbing, just patting, like the other girls had shown her. It was a strange ritual, but not uncommon. In the 1880s, meat wasn't just food, it was beauty. For pale, drawn women in big cities, fresh beef or veal was believed to revive the face, reducing under-eye circles, lifting pallor, and bringing color back to the skin. Even fashion magazines had recommended it. A strip of raw veal, held beneath the chin or pressed over the eyes for 20 minutes, was supposed to restore youthful firmness. Not permanently, of course, but just long enough to pass. In truth, it wasn't always about beauty. It was about illusion. Because in Josie's world, how you looked determined whether you got hired, got fed, or got ignored. Men could show up greasy and grim, but women were supposed to arrive fresh-faced and glowing, no matter how exhausted they were. So women like Josie adapted. They learned little tricks. A pinch of beetroot on the lips, a dusting of flour to fake powder, and when necessary, a cut of cheap liver, kept wrapped in cotton and hidden in a tin on the windowsill. Josie didn't enjoy it, but she understood it. She lifted the muslin away from her cheek and looked again. Already, the skin had turned a soft pink. Slightly warm, alive. The puffiness was still there, but the shadows had retreated. She looked, if not healthy, then at least hopeful. And that was enough, because in the absence of sleep, meat became magic. In a decade before cold creams and face tonics, when soap was harsh and skincare a fantasy, these rituals filled a gap. They weren't elegant, they weren't fragrant, but they worked. Josie wasn't alone. Across the tenement halls, other women did the same. Some used suet instead, scraped from the fat of old roasts, rubbed on the forehead to smooth wrinkles. Others swore by bacon. The grease, they said, softened the skin. The boarding house had its own stories. There was Mary, who once tried salted pork on her temples after a night of crying, and Annie, who believed raw chicken breast worked better than ice. No one laughed, because no one had better. And anyway, it wasn't as strange as it sounded. Doctors in the 1880s had long promoted the health benefits of raw meat. They prescribed beef extract for anemia, meat juice for weakness, and flesh poultices for inflammation. If it could heal the inside, why not the outside too? Even newspapers occasionally ran pieces on the subject. Beefsteak for the bloom, one headline had chirped in 1883. A Parisian secret to restore complexion. Paris, of course. That was the trick. If something sounded French, it suddenly became fashionable. Even if it smelled like a butcher's shop. Josie didn't care about Paris. She cared about her future. So she wrapped the liver again, carefully, and placed it back in its tin. Then she pinched her cheeks, gently this time, and tied her bonnet tight. Outside, the street was loud with carts and coal smoke. But her skin glowed a little more warmly now. Not from health, not from happiness, but from meat. And sometimes, that was enough to survive. Not all meat was created equal, at least not in the world of 1880s beauty. Some women swore by calf's liver, while others insisted that veal was gentler on sensitive skin. A few adventurous souls even dabbled with aged beef, arguing that the richer the iron, the richer the blush. It was a peculiar hierarchy. At the local butchers, the old women might line up for soup bones and stew cuts, while younger girls hovered near the fresher trays, their eyes darting to the blood-rich slices that might double as rouge. The butchers, of course, didn't ask questions. They knew. Everyone knew. In fact, it had become something of a quiet marketplace trend. Some butchers began setting aside the best-looking pieces, smooth, thin cuts with minimal fat or gristle, not for the pan, but for the powder room. They called it ladies' liver or, more delicately, complexion cuts. It wasn't a joke. In a world where most women couldn't afford soap, let alone cosmetics, a scrap of raw meat offered the illusion of health. And health, in Victorian society, was shorthand for virtue. Rosy cheeks meant you were well-fed, well-rested, and respectable. Pale or gray skin meant poverty, illness, or worse, moral failure. So women got creative. They didn't just dab the meat on their faces. Some kept it tucked in cloth at their necks, like a compress, believing the warmth would pull blood closer to the skin. Others wore tiny veal patches while they slept, like grotesque beauty masks. One girl in Cincinnati was said to wear thin liver slivers across her temples each night, believing it would preserve her youth. There were even whispered recipes. Rub the meat with rosewater first to cut the smell. Wrap it in cotton soaked with vinegar and honey. Use it fresh, never frozen. It must still bleed a little. Magazines catered to it, even if they didn't call it what it was. In the pages of the Delineator or Goddess Lady's book, you might find euphemistic references to natural facial tonics or organic facial stimulants. But every woman knew what that meant. It meant beef. The strange thing was, this wasn't entirely outside of medical advice. Doctors in the 1880s were infatuated with meat. They believed it gave strength, restored vitality, and corrected female weakness. Many prescribed meat therapy for everything from hysteria to anemia. One New York doctor even argued that raw beef applied externally could cure fainting spells. Another popular idea was that meat, being dense with blood, could remind a woman's body how to circulate properly. Skin, they said, simply needed to relearn its color. Of course, no one asked the meat how it felt about that. The kitchens of tenement buildings reeked of iron and vinegar in the mornings, not from breakfast, but from beauty. Women washed the previous day's liver in cold water and hung it out to dry, only to use it again later that night. Sometimes, flies got to it. But what could you do? Not everyone could afford fresh every day. There was a kind of sisterhood in the strangeness. Women traded tips, borrowed each other's muslin wraps, and quietly exchanged cuts behind market stalls. It was understood. It wasn't about vanity. It was about survival. Because makeup, in any traditional sense, was scandalous. Paint was for actresses, dancers, and fallen women. But meat? That was medicine. That was virtue, cleverly disguised. Josie, like the others, knew the rules. Never wear it too long, lest it stain. Never let it drip, or people would stay. Always keep it wrapped. Always keep it secret. She once met a girl who claimed to use beef tongue, thinly sliced and pressed under her eyes at night. It molds to the face better, she said proudly, like she was describing a fine cosmetic tool. Another woman claimed salt pork could erase laugh lines. Josie had laughed at that, then tried it. Because why not? The world had offered so few tools. If pressed meat could soften the edge of a long day, it was worth a try. Some men mocked the practice, if they found out. They said it was grotesque, ridiculous. But men didn't have to keep up appearances. They didn't have to smile when tired, glow when sick, or blush on cue. So the women carried on, with their veal poultices and pork compresses, their secrets wrapped in brown paper, hidden in the backs of iceboxes. And every now and then, as they looked in cracked mirrors and watched the pale warmth bloom across their cheeks, they smiled. Not because it was working, but because, for once, they felt seen. There was something oddly democratic about using meat as makeup. In the slums of Boston, a girl might press a penny's worth of calf's liver to her cheeks before heading out to mend socks for a living. Meanwhile, on Fifth Avenue, a debutante might do the very same thing, except her cut would be trimmed neater, her mirror gold-rimmed, and the parlor lit with gaslight. Meat blurred the lines between classes, if only for a moment. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the trend. Some physicians warned that raw meat could inflame the nerves or excite unnatural desires. Victorian code for anything vaguely unsanctioned. Others worried about bacteria, though the germ theory of disease was still whispering its way into public consciousness. But the real pushback didn't come from doctors. It came from the cosmetic elite, those women who had the means to import proper rouge from Paris or London. These ladies sniffed at veal-based beauty and called it butcher's shop vanity. Still, they knew. Everyone knew. Even if you didn't dab meat on your face yourself, someone at your tea table probably did. Behind every too rosy cheek lurked a secret, a cold cut pressed gently into the flesh. And then there were the actresses. Stage women had always worn heavy paint, grease-based concoctions made from lead, lard, or brick dust. But in the 1880s, some began blending their rouge with finely minced meat, creating thick, red salves that clung under hot stage lights. They called it slab blush. In New York, a famous chorus girl was said to have kept a small parcel of salted pork in her dressing drawer, which she pressed into her cheeks during intermissions. One jealous rival once swapped it for suet as a prank. The results were memorable. Newspapers caught on to the rumors. Articles titled "Liver Ladies of the Stage" or "Veal," the new rouge, popped up in satirical columns. Cartoonists sketched dainty girls holding steaks to their faces like cold compresses. Still, behind the satire was truth. Because women were doing what women had always done, making do. In the beauty columns of women's magazines, the language became increasingly coded. Advice like use natural protein-based stimulants to encourage circulation or embrace organic flush-enhancing methods became shorthand for what was now a fully public secret. Even the ads got cheeky. One soap company ran an ad that read, "Smell like roses, not ribs. Try our floral wash after your facial tonics." By 1885, the meat trend was at its cultural peak. Wealthy women hosted natural beauty luncheons, where they served beef broth and discussed the latest in liver toning. Some claimed that the scent helped digestion. In truth, it was a strange bonding ritual. But not everyone played along. In more conservative households, the idea of touching raw meat, especially to one's face, was considered vulgar, even sinful. A woman in Providence was publicly shamed after a neighbor spotted her hanging veal strips on the line beside the laundry. She claimed it was for her cat. No one believed her. Then there were the meat shortages. During one harsh winter in Chicago, a rumor spread that meat wares were buying up the choicest cuts, leaving less for working families. Suddenly, it wasn't a beauty ritual, it was selfishness. The butcher's wife had to start keeping a secret ledger. One column for food, one for face cuts. As with all fads, the backlash grew. Some doctors tried to steer women towards safer alternatives, like crushed beet juice, lemon rinds, or tinted lanolin. Others insisted that the trend was causing women to fall ill, not from germs, but from the emotional burden of pretending to glow. But still, in private, it continued. Girls pressed brisket slices into napkins, tucked them under corsets, and tiptoed to their mirrors like alchemists. They whispered about which meats woke up the skin best, which ones left a sour smell, and how long to let it sit before blotting. They weren't trying to look painted. They were trying to look healthy. And in a world where color meant class, they'd found a way to fake it. Not with rouge, but with something cheaper, something raw, something honest in its strangeness. And so the trend simmered on, not quite polite, not quite shameful, nestled somewhere between beauty and survival. Josie, for her part, had become efficient. She knew just how long to leave the liver out to soften, how to fold the linen so it wouldn't stain her collar, and how to toss it before it went sour. She never told her husband. He just thought she had good color lately. She smiled at that. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the mirror, and the blush that bloomed, like a secret garden, just beneath the skin. By mid-1885, meat as makeup had become both an open secret and a quiet scandal. It was no longer the whispered trick of only working-class women or actresses. It had crept into parlors with ivory-handled brushes and into the boudoirs of women who had never once lifted a roasting pan. But as the trend grew, so did the logistics. Meat, after all, didn't keep. Without refrigeration, women had to get creative. Some swore by pressing the meat between two chilled porcelain plates overnight. Others folded it into cloth sachets with lavender, hoping to mask the scent. The bolder ones simply kept the slice in a jewelry box, beside brooches and faded love letters. Mabel, a young milliner in Philadelphia, took it further. She began drying thin strips of veal on her windowsill, then rehydrating them with rosewater before use. She called them her complexion veils. Her landlady called it deeply unsettling. Of course, this delicate dance with decomposition had its risks. More than one society column featured stories of ladies whose face cutlets went sour during an opera or carriage ride. In summer, the risk doubled. A meat pouch cheek might be pink with health or red with heat rash. You never quite knew. There were horror stories. One woman reportedly developed a rash shaped like a pork chop. Another fainted on a train from the smell of her own beauty regimen. And in one infamous case, a wealthy matron sued her butcher, claiming his spoiled veal had cost her a suitor. The case was dismissed. Still, despite all this, despite the stays, the smells, the occasional unseasonal rash, the practice persisted. And not just among women, because where there is vanity, there is always crossover. Enter the rouge dandies. In the smoky gentlemen's clubs of Boston and Baltimore, a handful of fashion-forward young men began experimenting with natural flush enhancers. They claimed it helped them look vigorous, athletic, ready for a duel or a dance. Some wrapped liver in silk and applied it in secret. One daring soul wore it openly, calling it my cheek steak. It did not catch on widely, but it existed, and it further blurred the lines. Meat had become something new. Not food, not fashion, something stranger. A symbol of wealth for those who could waste it, of cleverness for those who finessed it, of desperation for those who needed it. Butchers began to notice. Their ledgers began to reflect two economies, one for dinner tables, one for dressing tables. Some added a wink when weighing out face cuts. Others sold trimmings under the counter to regulars. A few even offered complexion specials, thinner slices, chilled and wrapped in linen. Advertisements adapted. One London paper ran a cheeky ad that read, "Veal cheeks for your cheeks. Ask for our beauty bundle." Meanwhile, scientists, always lagging slightly behind public behavior, began to study the phenomenon with puzzled fascination. Was there something in the meat? Some circulatory boost? Some skin-tightening enzyme? The answer was, not really. At best, the pressure of the chilled meat might stimulate blood flow. At worst, it did nothing, or caused a rash. But by then, the truth hardly mattered. This was about performance. Just as a woman might faint gracefully into her settee or dab perfume behind her ears, she now added meat to the ritual. Not because it worked, but because it meant something. A woman with pink cheeks signaled health. Health signaled virtue. And virtue, at least in 1885, was always on display. Even as meat prices rose, even as critics scolded the practice as vulgar or unladylike, it clung on. It clung like grease to linen. And in some places, it turned competitive. Beauty contests in rural county fairs occasionally added a new twist, the natural glow category. Girls competed not with powder, but with fresh-kissed cheeks. A wink from a judge could mean she'd chosen the right cut. One year, a girl named Fanny was disqualified for using bacon. Too streaky, they said. The beauty columns of magazines adjusted their tone. Too. No longer condemning the practice outright, they began offering better meat suggestions. Chicken livers were said to be too pale. Beefsteak, too heavy. Veal remained the gold standard, tender and blush-tinted. And so, with mirrors fogged and cheeks flushed, women continued. Not out of vanity, but out of hope. Hope that a little color could buy them a second look, a better offer, a gentler judgment. And maybe it did. Maybe a bit of veal on a winter's cheek turned a moment. Maybe it didn't. But in a world where beauty was demanded and resources were scarce, women carved out a ritual for themselves, one slice at a time. By the fall of 1885, what began as a whispered beauty ritual had grown into a quiet but booming economy. Small-town butchers began stocking what they now called beauty veal, slicing it thin and wrapping it neatly in wax paper. Some even affixed handwritten labels, face only, not for frying. One enterprising butcher in Cincinnati offered complexion bundles that included chilled veal, a sprig of mint, and a little linen square for pressing. He sold out weekly. Beauty salons, ever eager to chase novelty, began offering meat pressing treatments. Women would lie back in chaise lounges while cold slices were applied delicately to their cheeks, temples, and necks. A few salons even played hot music during the procedure, as if to distract from the fact that their clients were, in effect, being seasoned. In New York, a Madame Levine claimed to have pioneered a veal toner treatment for tired actresses and opera singers. Her secret? She marinated the meat in rosewater and vinegar before pressing it into the skin. She described the process as revitalizing, euphoric, and mildly sacred. It smelled like a deli. Still, women lined up. They came by carriage and on foot, clutching little lace handkerchiefs and coins wrapped in ribbon. Some came twice a week. One society girl was rumored to have had her own personal meat courier who delivered a cut every morning, wrapped in silk and cooled with a block of ice the size of a fist. And yet, for all the business it created, it also created new anxieties. Women began to worry. Was my meat too thick? Too pale? Too warm? Fashion columns printed veal-tinted shade guides. Rosé veal became the most sought-after tone, soft pink, not too red, with a Belvedere marbling. Anything browner was considered cutlet-colored and therefore vulgar. Meat quality, too, took center stage. Working-class women, unable to afford the ideal cuts, began improvising. Some used scraps from stew meat, soaking them in milk to soften the edges. Others turned to organ meat, rubbing chilled chicken livers across their faces in quiet defiance of cost and social hierarchy. Meanwhile, reformers and doctors started to take notice. A Boston physician, Dr. Curtis Willoughby, wrote a widely circulated pamphlet titled "A Veal and Vanity, a Warning to Young Ladies." In it, he claimed that meat-based makeup was a vector for microbial intrusion, possibly contributing to a recent uptick in facial abscesses and mysterious cheek boils. His evidence was thin. His tone was not. Might as well press a ham to your forehead, he sneered. It would achieve the same result, and render you equally ridiculous. Others agreed. Some churches urged their congregations to avoid what they deemed fleshly ornamentation. One preacher in Ohio referred to it as the devil's rue. He declared, only vanity would drive a woman to smear her face with the slaughtered flesh of beasts. Still, the trend continued. Not because it was glamorous, but because, in its strange way, it felt practical. Powders and rouges could stain. Paints were expensive. But meat? Meat was available. And in a world where a woman's value was often tied to her complexion, to her ability to appear healthy and fresh, this was simply one more tool in the kit. It didn't matter how odd it seemed. If it worked, even just a little, it was worth it. And so meat found itself on dresses and in vanity drawers. It sat nestled in tins and cooling jars. It was pressed against faces in the early morning light and tucked back into cupboards before suitors called. Some women even shared tips, quietly, of course, in sewing circles and kitchens, over tea or vinegar rinses. Press it cold. Don't overuse. Change it out every day or the smell lingers. It was a strange sisterhood, bound not by fashion but by circumstance, bound by the pressure to be pleasing and the cleverness to find new ways to be so. By the end of the year, one magazine ran a cartoon, a dainty young woman peeking into her icebox, whispering to a chicken breast, "You'll do just fine, my day." It was meant to mock, but many women just nodded and turned the page. Because behind every joke about meat cheeks was a quieter truth. Beauty had always demanded sacrifice, just now it demanded seasoning too. And as long as mirrors existed, and marriage markets stayed brutal, the cold logic of veal makeup endured. Not for love of meat, but for the hope of being seen. Of course, not all slices stayed fresh. For every carefully chilled, rosewater-soaked veal medallion applied to a hopeful debutante's cheek, there were plenty more that had overstayed their welcome. Meat, after all, is meat. And no matter how delicately pressed or reverently handled, flesh left too long on a vanity table, or worse, under a corset, tended to do what flesh always does. It toned. Whispers of complexion rot began circulating quietly by spring of 1886. Women spoke of it in coded language at the apothecary. She's developing spots. I think the veal was bad. She left it on too long. Some of the cases were mild, little red patches, itchy cheeks, nothing a dab of cold cream and a few days of shame couldn't fix. But others, not so lucky. There were tales of cheeks so inflamed they puffed out like overboiled dumplings. Of women waking up to find their skin sticky and discolored, like wallpaper after a leak. One woman in Pittsburgh reportedly fainted when she peeled the meat away and found it clinging. Doctors began to call it dermal putrefaction, though most agreed that wasn't quite the term. Still, the phrase stuck. It wasn't long before the press picked up on it. The Chicago Tribune ran an article titled Putrid Paint, Dangers of Delicata Cosmetics, accompanied by a lurid illustration of a woman being chased by a ham. Harper's Weekly published a grim satire, a fashion spread featuring veal hats, beef bracelets, and a purse that dripped. That one hit a little too close to home for some. Mothers warned their daughters to stop. Husbands raised their eyebrows at strange smells wafting from the dressing room. One bachelor in St. Louis claimed he ended an engagement after finding suspicious marrow on his fiancée's pillow. Still, as always, the truth was messier. Yes, bad meat caused breakouts. Yes, there were cases of rash, even minor infections. But for most women, the fear wasn't sickness, it was embarrassment. Because for all its grotesque possibilities, veal makeup had never been about logic. It was about illusion. And for many women, maintaining that illusion, even just for one more outing, one more photograph, one more hopeful glance from across the room, was worth the risk of smelling vaguely like a stew. Yet even illusions grow stale. By the summer of 1886, alternative began to appear. A chemist in Philadelphia, one Dr. Emil Resto, began selling what he called essence of veal in small amber bottles. It was, in theory, a distillation of meat's tonic properties without the need to refrigerate your cheeks. He marketed it as refinement without rind. It sold reasonably well, but it didn't cool the skin the same way. Nor did it carry that peculiar psychological comfort, the quiet knowledge that, beneath the satin gloves and Sunday best, one was armed with something secret and strange, chilled and just a little wild. The charm was fading, though. Women were growing tired of checking for spoilage, of explaining themselves, of pretending not to smell faintly of yesterday's supper. Besides, newer powders were arriving from Paris. Featherlight, scented, packaged in tins with ribbons and cherubs. They didn't need to be butchered first. And so, bit by bit, the veal vanished. Quietly, without protest, meat drawers returned to their rightful culinary purpose. Linen squares no longer carried streaks of broth. Beauty advice columns turned their attention to egg white masks and cucumber slices. By the end of the decade, the practice was little more than a punchline, a strange footnote in the evolution of cosmetics. Something grandmothers might mention with a chuckle. We used to put veal on our faces, you know. And their granddaughters would wince, wide-eyed, and say, "That's disgusting." They wouldn't be wrong. But still, there had been a time, brief though it was, when a woman's glow came not from rouge or shimmer, but from something colder, stranger, and undeniably raw. Not for fashion, not for vanity, but because, in a world that asked women to be ever young and ever fresh, even the most absurd methods could feel rational. Even meat could become makeup. And so, the slices were laid, the skin was pressed, and somewhere in the back of a cupboard, another little veal parcel slowly turned, waiting to be beautiful. By the time 1890 rolled around, you could walk through most parlors and not catch even a whiff of veal. The little ceramic meat dishes were quietly put away, or more often, simply repurposed, used to hold buttons, thimbles, or loose change. The cooling cloths were relegated to the linen drawer, still faintly smelling of rosewater and broth. And the meat itself, gone, or eaten, or discarded, or remembered only in vague, humorous tones by women who would never, ever admit just how committed they'd once been. By then, the cosmetic world had moved on. The French were exporting violet powders that shimmered ever so slightly in the candlelight. German chemists were tinkering with petroleum-based pomades, promising eternal youth in tins labeled with Greek goddesses. And American women, always somewhere between practicality and pageantry, leaned into the convenience of things that didn't need to be kept on ice. Makeup was entering the modern age. More lab coat than butcher's apron. But veal? Veal was already fading into myth. It became one of those strange bits of whispered lore, like radium toothpaste or arsenic wafers, a historical hiccup everyone pretended not to take too seriously. Something that was probably exaggerated, or just a thing rich ladies did, even though it wasn't. In truth, meat-based skincare had reached deep into the middle-class psyche. It was born not from wealth, but from desperation, fueled by the unrelenting pressure to look fresh, pale, and poreless in a time when beauty was both armor and expectation. And though it seems absurd now, laughable, even, it was never a joke to them. It was effort. It was ritual. It was a kind of invisible devotion. But history, as it so often does, sanded down the edges. It replaced the texture of rawness with the smoothness of summary. A single sentence in a textbook, perhaps. In the 1880s, some women briefly used chilled veal as a cosmetic to cool and whiten the skin. Just that. No mention of the women who woke early to prepare the slices, who hid them under their corsets on warm days, praying they wouldn't shift or sweat, who endured the stays and whispers, not because they believed they were beautiful, but because they were trying to be.